We are all running toward a singular, obsessive fantasy. The finish line. The day we finally make enough money to quit, to retire, to be free. But society rarely tells you what happens the day after you cross it. In 2021, a 35-year-old man sold his company for over $100 million. He bought his freedom. He traveled the world. He partied. And slowly, he began to feel completely, terrifyingly empty. His name is Peter Steinberger, and his story reveals the darkest lie of the modern hustle. It proves that reaching the top of the mountain will destroy you, unless you understand the absolute terrifying power of play. Today, we explore the curse of early retirement and how abandoning your ambitions might be the only way to actually win. Let's begin. Peter Steinberger did not wake up one morning with a world-changing vision. He didn't have a TED Talk epiphany in the shower. He wasn't sitting in a Silicon Valley coffee shop, sketching out a billion-dollar idea on a napkin. He was on a subway in Vienna, trying to send a message, and the app failed him. That's it. That's the whole origin story. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it obliterates the mythology we've constructed around genius and success. We've been sold this narrative, this cinematic lie, that great things are born from great intentions, that the builders of empires were motivated by noble purpose, by vision, by a burning desire to change the world. But the neuroscience tells a different story. There is a psychological mechanism called sublimation, a concept first articulated by Freud, later expanded by psychoanalytic tradition, and it is, perhaps, the most underrated engine of human achievement. Sublimation is the process by which a raw, socially unacceptable impulse, rage, frustration, grief, desire, gets transmuted into something constructive, something generative, something brilliant. Think of it like this: frustration is a fuel. Most people let it evaporate. They vent it into the void, into arguments, complaints, doom scrolling, passive despair. The energy dissipates. Nothing is built. But a rare few, and Peter was one of them, they bottle that frustration, they compress it, and they use the pressure to power something. He was annoyed that PDF handling on iOS was catastrophically bad, not philosophically troubled, not morally outraged, annoyed, the way you're annoyed when your coffee is lukewarm. And instead of accepting that minor daily inconvenience as the texture of modern life, the way the rest of us do, he refused. That refusal became PSPDF kit. This is what the self-help industry consistently gets backwards. It tells you to find your passion, to locate some glowing, pre-existing ember of purpose within yourself and fan it into flame. But passion, in that romanticized sense, is extraordinarily rare. What is not rare, what is, in fact, universal, is frustration. Every single human being alive is daily confronted with things that don't work, systems that are broken, frictions that shouldn't exist. The difference between the person who builds an empire and the person who doesn't is not passion. It is the direction in which they channel their irritation. Peter channeled his into code, line by line, into a SDK that would eventually become the infrastructure beneath some of the most used document tools on the planet. Not because he wanted to be rich, not because he wanted to be famous, but because something was broken and that bothered him, and he had the audacity to do something about it. 13 years later, he would cross the finish line. And that is where the real story begins. 13 years is a long time to run. Think about what that means viscerally, not as an abstraction, as a lived experience. 13 years of early mornings and late nights, 13 years of payroll anxiety, of product failures, of customer complaints, of legal disputes, of the grinding, relentless psychological weight of being responsible for something larger than yourself. 13 years of meaningful suffering. And then, in 2021, it ended. Peter Steinberger sold PSPDF kit for approximately 100 million euros. He was 35 years old. He had, by every measurable definition, won. He achieved what the modern cultural religion calls FIRE, financial independence, retire early, the dream. The thing whispered about in Reddit threads at 2 a.m. by people who hate their jobs but are too terrified to admit it. He didn't just approach the finish line. He obliterated it. And then he began to disappear. Not physically, but internally. The dissolution was subtle at first. A slight flatness to the days, a vague sense that something was off. He traveled, he checked in to beautiful hotels, he ate extraordinary meals, he experienced what every exhausted, overworked person fantasizes about during their commute. And none of it touched the void that was quietly opening up inside him. Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century philosopher who was perhaps the world's most rigorous pessimist, described human existence as a pendulum. On one end, suffering, on the other, boredom, and the pendulum swings endlessly between the two. When we are striving, when we are fighting, building, struggling, we exist in the domain of suffering. It is painful, yes, but it is oriented. It has direction. It has the terrible mercy of necessity. But when the struggle ends, when you achieve what you were fighting for, the pendulum swings to the other side, and what waits there is not paradise. What waits there is the void. Schopenhauer called it Langeweile, boredom, but that word is catastrophically insufficient for what he was describing. This is not the mild restlessness of a slow Sunday afternoon. This is existential directionlessness. This is the experience of waking up in a universe that no longer has a claim on your attention, your effort, your identity. This is nihilism. Not as a philosophical position, but as a felt experience. The sensation that nothing matters, not because the world is cruel, but because you've removed all the structures that were creating meaning. We use the phrase golden handcuffs to describe how high salaries trap people in careers they hate. But Peter had discovered something more insidious, the golden cage of freedom itself. A prison with no bars, no guards, no walls, just infinite, unstructured space, and the horrifying discovery that human beings are not built for infinite, unstructured space. Financial freedom is not the destination. For many people, It is the beginning of the most disorienting experience of their lives. The question was, why? Why does crossing the finish line feel like falling off a cliff? To answer that, we need to go inside the brain. Your brain was not designed for happiness. I want to be very precise about that because it's a statement that sounds nihilistic but is actually deeply clarifying. The human brain, the 3-pound electrochemical organ that generates your entire subjective experience of existence, was designed by millions of years of evolution for one singular purpose: survival through problem solving. At the center of this system is dopamine, and dopamine is wildly misunderstood. Popular culture has reduced it to a pleasure chemical, something that squirts into your brain when you eat chocolate or receive a like on Instagram. But that's not quite right. Neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky and others have demonstrated that dopamine is not primarily a reward signal. It is an anticipation and effort signal. Dopamine surges not when you get what you want, but in the process of working toward what you want. It is the neurochemical engine of striving. Here is the implication that should stop you cold if dopamine is activated by the pursuit, by obstacles, by uncertainty, by the gap between where you are and where you're trying to go. Then what happens when the obstacles disappear? What happens when there is no more gap? What happens when you've solved the problem permanently? The dopamine system collapses. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the baseline, the ambient level of neurochemical motivation that gets you out of bed and makes life feel worth engaging with, that baseline erodes, and what fills the space is a particular kind of gray. Not sadness, exactly, not depression in the clinical sense, something more like static. The screen is on, but there's no signal. Neuroscientists sometimes call this hedonic adaptation, the process by which your brain recalibrates to a new normal and strips away the emotional charge from things that used to feel meaningful. We intuitively understand this with physical sensation. If you hold an ice cube long enough, your hand stops feeling cold. The sensation doesn't vanish. The ice is still freezing, but your nervous system has adapted to it. It's no longer information, it's just background. The same mechanism operates on your emotional landscape. Luxury, leisure, freedom, when they become permanent and unearned, stop registering as pleasure and begin registering as default, and default is invisible. This is why the phrase meaningful friction is not motivational poetry. It is a neurological prescription. The research of psychologists like Ari Kruglansky on motivational goal systems demonstrates that human psychological functioning depends on a continuous cycle of goal pursuit. Setting an aim, encountering resistance, exerting effort, achieving progress. Remove any element of that cycle, particularly the resistance, and the system doesn't thrive, it stalls. Peter Steinberger had removed the resistance completely, categorically. He had solved, at age 35, the problem of financial survival that most humans spend their entire lives trying to solve. And in doing so, he had inadvertently dismantled the very architecture that was generating his sense of vitality. He was free, and freedom without friction is indistinguishable from emptiness. He needed to find his way back, not to the grind, not to the hustle matrix, not to the 13-year sprint, but to something older, more fundamental, and infinitely more powerful. He needed to find his way back to play. 3 years after selling his company, Peter Steinberger sat down at his keyboard, not to build a product, not to generate revenue, not to validate a business thesis, but because something in the emerging world of AI made him curious. Made him, in his own words, want to tinker. He wasn't trying to change the world again. He was, by his own admission, just playing around. In approximately 1 hour, he assembled a rough prototype of an AI assistant using early tool use APIs. He gave it a name, OpenClaw, and it featured, for reasons that were entirely whimsical, a small red lobster as its mascot. He pushed it to GitHub. He wrote a brief description, and then he went to sleep. By morning, it was trending. Within days, it had accumulated thousands of stars. The project drew attention from researchers, developers, and, eventually, from OpenAI itself, whose team reached out to explore collaboration. A 1-hour experiment born entirely from curiosity and playfulness had produced more visible impact than much of what he'd done with deliberate, high-stakes intention. How do we explain this? What is actually happening here at the level of psychology and philosophy? Let's begin with the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, non-action, or more precisely, action that is not forced. Wu Wei is one of the most misunderstood ideas in Eastern philosophy, because in translation it sounds passive, it sounds like doing nothing, but that is not what it means. Wu Wei describes a mode of engagement where effort is effortless, where action flows from a place of naturalness, of alignment, rather than from striving, from ego, from the anxious energy of needing a particular outcome. The Taoist sage does not hammer the nail. The Taoist sage allows the hammer to fall. In Western psychological terms, this maps almost perfectly onto what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian-American psychologist, spent decades studying and called flow. Flow is the state of complete absorption in an intrinsically motivated activity. It occurs at the precise intersection of high skill and high challenge, when what you're doing is difficult enough to demand your full attention, but not so overwhelming that it triggers anxiety. In flow, the internal critic goes quiet, the performance anxiety evaporates, time distorts, and the work that emerges from that state is, consistently, empirically, the most creative, most generative work a person is capable of producing. But here is the part that matters. Flow cannot be forced. It cannot be manufactured by ambition. It cannot be purchased by discipline. It is almost always blocked, paradoxically, by caring too much about the outcome. The more you need the project to succeed, the more your identity, your financial security, your sense of self-worth is riding on the result. The more you activate the prefrontal cortex's evaluative, critical functions, and the harder flow becomes to enter. Peter, when he built OpenClaw, had nothing to prove, no investors to satisfy, no runway to protect, no reputation riding on whether a tiny red lobster mascot was a good idea. Peter, when he built OpenClaw, had nothing to prove, No investors to satisfy, no runway to protect, no reputation riding on whether a tiny red lobster mascot was a good idea. This is what I want you to understand because it is deeply counterintuitive and it cuts directly against everything the hustle culture narrative tells you. The absence of financial pressure does not guarantee creative stagnation. What guarantees creative stagnation is the wrong kind of pressure. The pressure of ego, of proving, of justifying. Remove that pressure, not through wealth, but through the psychological shift from performing to playing, and the creative system opens up in ways that deliberate effort simply cannot access. The jazz musician who improvises without caring whether the audience approves will play something that the musician calculating every note for maximum applause will never discover. The writer who commits for 1 hour to writing only for themselves, with no thought of publication, reception, or critique, will find sentences that the writer obsessed with their Amazon ranking will never produce. Play is not the absence of seriousness. Play is seriousness liberated from self-consciousness. And this is the deepest irony embedded in Peter Steinberger's story, the version of him that sold his company, driven, relentless, brilliant, built something worth 100 million euros. The version of him that sat down with no plan and a red lobster just to see what would happen, that version attracted the attention of the most powerful AI lab on the planet. The hustle did not produce the most interesting thing he ever made. Play did. I want to offer you a redefinition, not of success, not of wealth, but of the word freedom itself. The version of freedom that the hustle matrix sells you is negative freedom. Freedom from your boss, freedom from your alarm clock, freedom from financial anxiety, from obligation, from debt, from the grinding weight of necessity. And that freedom is real. It has genuine value. I'm not here to tell you that financial security doesn't matter, but it is profoundly, dangerously incomplete. What Peter Steinberger discovered after 3 years of navigating the void, after the dopamine crash, after the Schopenhauerian pendulum swung all the way to the emptiness of pure leisure, is that the only freedom worth having is positive freedom. Freedom to, specifically, the freedom to spend your days doing things that feel less like work and more like play. Things that make you lose track of time. Things you would do even if no one were watching, even if no one were paying, even if no one cared. The finish line is a lie, not because success is meaningless, but because the finish line implies that there is a finish, that there is a point at which the game ends and the real life begins. But that framing is backwards. The game is the life. The process is the entire point. There is no moment after the finish line where everything becomes clear and peaceful and permanently satisfying. The process is the entire point. There is no moment after the finish line where everything becomes clear and peaceful and permanently satisfying. The Stoics understood this. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, arguably the most powerful person on earth during his lifetime, spent his nights writing in a private journal that he never intended for anyone to read. Meditations was not written for publication. It was written for himself as an act of ongoing, private, unperformed philosophy. That is play. That is a man with every conceivable form of external power and freedom choosing to return again and again to the thing that felt true to him, not because it was useful, but because it was meaningful, because it was his. So I want to leave you with a question, not a motivational prompt, not a call to hustle harder or optimize better, a genuine, uncomfortable, clarifying question. If starting tomorrow, you never had to work for money again, if the financial question were permanently solved, would you go quietly insane from the boredom, or would you find something to create simply because it felt like play? And if the honest answer is that you don't know, that you've been running so long toward the finish line that you've lost track of what you'd actually want to do if no one were watching and nothing were at stake, then maybe that's the most important thing you've heard all week. Write it in the comments. Not what you think you should want to do, what you would actually play at if playing were enough. If the lobster were enough. Because the people who know that answer, who can name it specifically without hesitation, those are the people who have already found the only finish line that doesn't destroy you when you cross it. I'm at Mind Boundaries, and I'll see you at the edge of the next question.